obviously the first thing that strikes you is the living conditions. But I don't think you dwell on that forever because immediately you start thinking, well, what could it be like and what should they be doing here?
The history of Pineland and the history of institutions in Maine is the history of us. It's the history of how we work with people who live on the fringe and who might be on the fringe.
And they had a group of people who treated as less than human. In fact, the standards there were less than the feds required for dogs.
And in many ways, the rise of institutions started in Bangor, Maine, with Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix moved to Boston, and she started seeing all the people with mental illness and developmental disabilities and noticing that they were all in prison and they were being institutionalized in prison.
The why of it is fear, fear and prejudice. I've trying to think of this for quite some time. Whether it's with prisons or the elderly people or poverty or with certainly at that time the stigmatism that went with mental retardation. There was a fear. There was, if you were, I felt, this is my own impression, I felt if you weren't blonde, blue-eyed, and beautiful and had all the great intellectual prowess and all the other things that went with it, I think that there was this attitude of society where someone had a mentally retarded child or an emotionally disturbed child or a physically disabled child, and someone could have all three of those combined in one in a circumstance like that. There was some sort of a societal stigmatism there, and people felt, well, gee, I've done something wrong. This is my impression. So when society went to deal with it, to the legislature says, well, maybe there is something wrong. I don't want to deal with it. The local communities didn't want to deal with it, so they built this big institution off in the woods.
Have you ever noticed how many town farm roads there are across this state? Like they're everywhere. Everywhere you go, you're driving by a town farm road. You ever wonder what that is all about? Well, what it was about was your selectmen and your city councilors. They ended up they had to do something. They were considered the overseers of the poor. That still is in statute, in fact. And they had to do something with people with disabilities or people with substance abuse problems or people who were widows who weren't allowed to own property yet and children who were orphans. And what they did is they hired a town farm manager, and they had a town farm on Town Farm Road. They sent everybody who was on the outside of society that didn't have a way of taking care of themselves financially and moving them all into the same barn and saying, we're going to build a town farm. So you had the elderly, you had all kinds of people all living together. Well, as you can imagine, great idea, didn't work. That was the real beginning of institutions, was our town farms. And they were wicked expensive. And the selectmen and the city councilors kept saying, well, what are we going to do? And abuse is happening there. It's just a nightmare. So you have two things happening at exactly the same time. You've got Dorothea Dix saying, there's got to be something better than this. And you've got all these towns and cities saying, there's got to be something better than this. So they answered the what if. They had a problem. They answered a what if, but it wasn't the right what if. It wasn't the what if of what if people were able to share their gift, and what does this elderly person have? What does this individual with Down syndrome have? What does this individual well, they didn't even know the names of these disabilities then too. They just knew somebody didn't fit in the box and we didn't know what to do with them. They answered that what if with building an institution. So they said, what if we had a different solution so that people didn't go into prisons? And what if we had something other than town farms?
They put me there and they went off. And it hurt. It hurt me so that, it wasn't my kind of place to be in.
It was like going to a strange place. I had to get used to the place.
It was called the Maine School for Feeble-Minded. And that wasn't just for children. That was for any age. You know, we are emptying out the town farms and putting people with developmental disabilities or people who appeared to have intellectual disabilities or people that did not have mental illness but who were very poor. Those people went to Pineland.
Why are we there at all? You know, what is the rationale for keeping people in this institution?
You know, in reflection, we closed Pineland, Maine's institution 25 years ago, but it was a story that started 150 years ago, if not even more. You know, how we've treated individuals with developmental disabilities and what people with developmental disabilities role has been kind of relegated to over the years has been not considered as a valuable member of society. You know, we tend to make a lot of stereotypical boxes, and human beings like to put people in boxes, and that really, you can see that really profoundly in the mid 1900s when we started labeling people with things like as idiots or morons, and that wasn't considered cruel. What that was considered as was to explain what they could do for work and what value they shared. So were they able to be trained? Were they able to do minor work? What was their role going to be in society? And that's where a lot of the institutional work of the early and mid 1900s was. And what's interesting about that is the conversation about what is valuable and what is the valued role was there, but it was there not from an individual base and not from a base of what gift might this person have to provide their community. It was what value might this entire general population of people with intellectual disabilities have for the entire group.
They said, you can't go all these through till you had your tube tied. I said, okay, tie them. So I get out.
You know, in many ways today, we are hearing about how we want things to be based on evidence-based practice so that people are getting the best treatment available. And this is a good thing. This is a really, really good thing. And we have to be aware of the process of science and how science goes. Science isn't a static process. It's a very fluid process. And for people with developmental disabilities, it's also really important to recognize they don't have the best experience with evidence-based practices. What? What do you mean they don't have the best experiences with evidence-based practices? Well, back in the 1910s, 1920s, there was a huge movement in the United States that said the cause of disease comes from that you inherit it. Well, that doesn't sound that different than today, does it, with genetics? No, it doesn't. And yet there was a twinge to it. Back then, they were looking at it through the lens of bloodlines, very similar to how we look at what is the bloodlines of horses or dogs or the genesis of plants. And that might sound terrible that we were looking at humans that way, but it was the time of labeling. That was the time in which our science was giving names, and having these kind of trees was the way our best scientists were making sense of it. But they made a mistake. They basically said, they were too simple. It was too simplistic. They basically said, if you have a disability, you should not be able to reproduce, because if you reproduce, then you will create an offspring with disabilities. If you have substance abuse, then you should not be able to reproduce, because if you reproduce, you will give birth to another individual with substance abuse. And this is simply too simplistic. We know now how simplistic this was. But it's also important to understand that this idea of eugenics came from a place of evidence-based and best knowledge of the time. But what it did to people with developmental disabilities, this reaction, was it took a lot of rights away. It stigmatized a lot of people, and it said this individual is essentially defective. And if we allow them to be in the general population, they're going to be dangerous, because what if they have sex and have a child that is now also defective? Now you have multiple people who are defective. And the response to that was a great boom of institutionalization. And in some parts of the country, including Maine, although Maine is not as bad as some parts of the country, a lot of people who were being forced to have their bodies sterilized so they couldn't reproduce, because it was hard to find people who weren't going to have sex. And it was hard to stop the abuse that was happening in institutions around sex. So this was mostly done in women. I'm not exactly sure why, but I'm pretty sure that gender bias was in there, because it's kind of easy to sterilize a man, because you have to overlay all of the injustices with all of our social biases. But we did this under the name of evidence-based practice and science.
I said, they did going to take the teeth out with pliers. They did that, as they sure did.
They couldn't punish you?
What did they do for punishment?
Lock you up in the room. They couldn't touch me. I went over and told.
They did what to your hair?
Shaved your hair, bald head.
Yes, they did. You run away.
Yeah.
They would shave your hair if you ran away?
Yeah. They put you in that bathtub, put ice in it, and then strapped you.
So what they would do is, if a kid was bad, they might haul him in here, fill that with ice water.
Yeah, put ice packs on you, and then strap you, and that don't show. If they get you fresh cold enough, it doesn't show.
In the past, we had this overcrowded institution in which the easiest way for people to get people clean was to strip a whole bunch of people naked, take a fire hose, and give them a shower. You know, it goes back to a value statement. What if what you're valuing is cleanliness? Well, people in the institution got a shower, but they got it naked in front of a lot of people with a fire hose. That might have made sense. Maybe not, but it certainly was an easy way to get a lot of people clean. Well, I guess what was your value at the time? There was a lot of physical abuse. There was a lot of things that we call abuse now that they called medically necessary. So, for instance, did you know it wasn't uncommon that if an individual was biting, for them to take and pull their teeth out? That there are people alive today that don't have teeth, not because of bad hygiene, but because they had the aggression of communication taken away from them, and they didn't have another way of communicating. There was a belief back then that people didn't feel pain in the same way. There was belief that people were not quite as human in the same way as everybody else. That still is there. You know, these are warnings of the past. Is how do you look at the history of the abuses today that we look at as clearly abusive? And how do we reflect today about the abusive that are happening today? And then the what if that didn't happen anymore?
We were told by the head of Children's Hospital in Boston that we should put Barbara in an institution and forget her. That didn't sit very well, but it must be remembered that in 1955 there just was no choice. You kept your child at home, or you accepted whatever institution you could put that child into. And for us it was Pownell State School.
In the past, we viewed people with developmental disabilities as things unfortunate mistakes, things you put away and you move away. And we told parents in the 20s and 30s and 40s that the best thing they could do was institutionalize their child and forget about them and have another child as soon as possible. And that was the advice that the professionals gave. Thank heavens, many parents did not do that. Many parents still cared about their child, but the institutional world really, really was traumatic to them as well. A lot of the reforms of the institution came from the people who loved the people who were in the institution, meaning the parents, the siblings, and even some of the staff people. There was a lot of abuse that happened in the institution. That's true. But there was a lot of love that happened too. And 25 years ago, we recognized that we needed to close Pineland. And Maine was one of the very first states to close Pineland, but we still didn't look at and ask the what if question the way we could have. The what if question is, what if people were valued and allowed to share their gift to their community? And what we did was we essentially closed the community, the institution, and said, wow, clearly we are abusing people and not treating people humanely in this spot. People deserve to be in the community, but we never really said, but what if we examine what individuals could offer with their roles? So it's almost like we looked at people with developmental disabilities in the wrong scale. And we put them in boxes and we put them in institutions, and they relegated their value based on broad strokes, which really, really hurt society. So when we're looking at the past of the what if everybody could be seeing their gift, what we're often seeing in the past is, what a shame that people's gift was not shown.